The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. In the ancient world, it would sometimes happen that the king or ruler of some great country would win a victory over another country and would make that country subservient to himself and would set up a binding agreement. I am doing this for you now, and you're going to do this for me. Or they might simply enter into some sort of a political agreement, but again and again there would be an agreement as to how the two of them would work together. That's putting it very broadly, and it would need a lot more scholarly bells and whistles if I were to spell it out fully. But the point is that in the Old Testament, we see again and again the Bible speaking about the covenant that God makes with certain people. The covenant is then a binding agreement, an agreement which God makes, which binds God, who is then going to be faithful to that covenant, and certainly binds the people with whom God is making that covenant. And this becomes a theme, a kind of a running topic, which goes on, because it isn't just nations that form covenants, it's individual people, of which the best known form of covenant is marriage itself. And indeed, as we'll see in a minute, marriage is one of the images which is used in the Old Testament for the binding agreement between God and Israel. And then that turns around in the New Testament to become the marriage of the Messiah and his bride, as all the way to the end of the book of Revelation. So where do we first meet this idea of covenant? Some people think in terms of God making a covenant with Adam or with Adam and Eve. Well, God certainly gives Adam and Eve instructions, be fruitful and multiply and look after the garden and so on. Genesis doesn't actually call that a covenant, but in the light of later things that happen, we can cautiously refer to Adam and Eve as being in covenant with God, which they then break, and then God has to expel them from Eden and so on. I'm always a bit wary of that because some people have tried to make too much of a supposed covenant with Adam and then deduce certain things from it. Let's not go there. Let's stick with where the Bible actually takes us, where the first covenant that we find is the covenant with Noah, and through Noah with all of creation. Because, as I said in an earlier section, when after Adam and Eve's time, the land was full, the earth was full of people who were rebelling against God and living by violence and were committing all kinds of wickedness. And the flood looks as though it's God's way of saying, this is what really ought to happen if I was being strictly just. Everything, all humans, everybody would be obliterated. But God is gracious, and his original purpose in creation is not going to be thwarted. So he calls Noah and his family, as it were, to restart the project, to be the beginning of a new wave for the human family on the face of the earth. And to show that they are not going to be destroyed by a flood, God puts his bow in the clouds like a warrior hanging up his bow, and so that the rainbow, the bow which appears in the clouds after rain, becomes a symbol in Genesis chapter 9 of the covenant that God makes with Noah and with all of creation. And it's a way of saying, I will be faithful to the whole of my creation. I will not let it be destroyed. And so everything that happens subsequently is a way of God saying, and this is how my faithfulness is going to work out. What is God going to do? Well, the next covenant that we meet is God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, which turns into God's covenant with Abraham because he's renamed. Abraham means I'm the father of many nations in Genesis 17, and then it's renewed again in Genesis 22. And in Genesis 15, it's a very dark and solemn thing. But the chapter begins with Abraham, who has been promised a land and a family, saying to God, excuse me, what's going to happen to this promise? Because I don't have a child, and someone else is going to inherit all that is mine. And God saying, actually, no. I am going to give you not just one child, but an uncountable inheritance, like the stars in the sky. And it says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. It's a very oblique phrase. It's not a phrase we would use today unless we were explicitly echoing a passage like that in the Bible. But as we see it working out, what it means is that God makes a covenant with Abraham, and then God is going to be faithful to that covenant. And Abraham becomes the one who is the covenant partner, the one who is to be righteous in God's sight, not just morally righteous, though that's of course part of the deal, but the one who is himself to be faithful to the covenant, and God will work through him. And the way that covenant is established is a strange old ritual which looks as if it belongs in the world of the ancient Near East, where they took sacrificial animals and killed them and cut them in two pieces, and then passed between the broken pieces of the bodies of the animals as a way of saying, if I am not faithful to this, then may I be pulled apart like these animals. Only in the case of the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15, it is God himself who passes through between the pieces of the animals as a way of saying God is going to be faithful to this covenant. And Genesis 15 comes all the way through into the New Testament. And in Galatians 3 and Romans 4, Paul draws on it, and he clearly knows the whole passage and has meditated on it as he sees the promise that God made to Abraham, that God would give him a family consisting of many nations and make him the father of a multitude of peoples, not just one family, but of people from every nation and tribe and tongue. God, says Paul, was faithful and is faithful to that promise. But as the story of Abraham and his family goes forward, with the covenant renewed through the badge of circumcision in Genesis 17, and then renewed again in 22 after Abraham has been commanded to sacrifice his son, and then God rescues him at the last minute, the story moves forward to the children of Israel in Egypt, and then God making a covenant with them at the time when he brings them out of Egypt and takes them to Mount Sinai. And God gives them the Torah, and the Torah, the law, beginning with the Ten Commandments, but really containing the whole law. The law is the charter of the covenant, that if you are to be God's covenant people, this is what it's going to look like. This is how you are to live as covenant people. And when Moses sprinkles the blood of the covenant upon them in Exodus 24, this is a way of saying you are now sanctified as the people in whose midst God is going to come and dwell. And that covenant remains there behind everything that happens subsequently in the Old Testament. But then the next time we meet covenant explicitly, it's with David. With David in 2 Samuel 7, when God promises him that in his seed there will be the chance to build the temple at last, so that God will come and dwell permanently in the midst of his people. And that God promises David not just that he will have one son who will build the temple, but that he will have an ongoing royal house forever. And this is picked up in the book of the Psalms, where in Psalm 89, the psalmist envisages God saying, I have made a covenant with David. His seed will I establish forever, and his throne will be before me to all generations. But then Psalm 89 is one of those psalms which changes in the middle. And having celebrated the covenant with David, the second half of the psalm says, but now it's all gone wrong. Now you have abandoned the covenant with your servant. You've cast it behind your back. You're not paying any attention because the present Davidic king is being overthrown. Lord, where are your steadfast love and mercy? What's happened to them? And so the covenant appears to be broken, and the psalmist is appealing to God on the basis of the unbreakable covenant which he made with David. But that's partly, of course, because, as we see in the book of Hosea, Israel was supposed to be Yahweh's bride. The book of Hosea looks back to the time when God brought Israel into the wilderness like a young man bringing his bride in order to woo her and make her his own, and looks back to the covenant that God made on Sinai as a marriage covenant. And Hosea is saying, but Israel has been unfaithful, and this is what happens as a result. It's going to be exile and all that follows from that. And so the exile is seen as this terrible moment, like a great divorce, when God appears to have broken off the covenant with Abraham, with David, with Israel as a whole. But in the promises of renewal in Isaiah, in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, we get the promise of the new covenant. The phrase new covenant occurs particularly in Jeremiah 31. God says, I will make a new covenant, not like the old covenant because they broke that one. But this time I'm going to put my law in their hearts, and they will be able to obey me from the heart, and I will be merciful to them, and I will remember their sin no more. And in Isaiah 54, verse 10, God says, I will now make with you the covenant of peace. That's a phrase that comes elsewhere, Ezekiel 34 and other places as well. Because of the work of the servant in Isaiah 52 and 53, God will renew the covenant, and this time it will be a covenant of peace. And as a result, chapter 55 of Isaiah says, I will make with anyone who is thirsty and comes to me to drink, I will make with them the covenant that I made with David. This is, as it were, the democratization of the Davidic promises and covenant, that anyone now who wants to benefit from Yahweh's generous presence and love and fruitful, fruit-bearing gifts, anyone can come and God will establish the covenant with them. And that's really the picture which is then picked up in the New Testament. So that though Jesus doesn't use the word covenant very often, he doesn't use it because it's kind of everywhere assumed. When he preaches the Sermon on the Mount and when he teaches in parables, it's all about what is God doing with Israel? How is God being faithful to the covenant? And the answer is, this is what it looks like when God's covenant faithfulness is unveiled. It looks like this young Jewish prophet going around celebrating the kingdom with all the wrong people, healing people, teaching wisely but challengingly about the seed growing secretly and all the rest of it, telling stories about a man who had 2 sons and one of them went off and one of them didn't, and so on and so on. All these things are ways of saying this is the story of Israel and how God is working that out. But it's not going to happen the way that you might have liked it to. God has new things to do, and that all comes to a head when Jesus takes his close followers, and on the night when he's going to be betrayed, he breaks bread with them and he says, this is now the new covenant, and pours out the wine. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, shed for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Drawing in those great themes from the book of Exodus, from Jeremiah, all the way back to Abraham, and perhaps also with echoes of Adam in behind. And so the New Testament builds out from that point to the new covenant promise in 2 Corinthians 3, to the whole letter to the Hebrews, which is all about how God's new covenant now looks like this, focused on Jesus and reaching out to all believers, and to Paul's expositions of the covenant theology in Romans 4 and Galatians 3 and so on. And again we see 2 things going on which many have found it difficult to hold together. On the one hand, covenant is all about God being faithful to his promises and never looking back and so on and so on. But on the other hand, it's all about God doing something new, God breaking into history and doing something completely unexpected. And it's only in retrospect, like on the road to Emmaus, and like in much of what Paul says, that we look back and we see what has happened in Jesus and his death and resurrection and his ascension as Lord and his gift of the Spirit. This is, in fact, what God's covenant faithfulness looked like, even though we hadn't seen it coming. And so we see the New Testament church going out as God's covenant partners, going out into the world to be a family of believers who are in covenant with one another, in covenant of unity and peace and siblinghood with one another, though that's been so hard to maintain. But within that, the families of the church, individual households being in covenant with one another and with the church, to be within the church and for the world, the sign of God's faithfulness. Faithfulness to creation, faithfulness to covenant, faithfulness which will result in the end, in the new heavens and the new earth, when the whole story from Genesis all the way through will finally come to completion. The sign over it will be, God was faithful, God is faithful, God has been and always will be faithful. That's covenant theology. Please feel free to click the link to watch the next video in this sequence.